Nukes, here we come.
Nukes, here we come. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm here back with Ryan Lafferty. Hopefully all of you know him at this point, world champion, and still debating at Dartmouth. And BP and APDA was, nationals champion. I think since the last time you've been on the channel, you've acquired a new national championship title. So congratulations on that.
Thank you,
Impressive
thank you.
as always. And specifically, I'm very excited to have you for this topic because as I have sort of gathered, you seem to be specifically a nuclear policy topic expert, or that's kind of like your niche.
I'm not sure if I'm an expert per se, but certainly like a informal expert or a person who consumes a lot more than average material relating to nuclear
Yeah,
weapons. So I
probably.
certainly have takes at bare minimum.
Yeah, closer to expert than probably a lot of your peers. So
Fair,
excited
fair.
to get your takes, of which I know that there are many, on this topic. So the first thing that I want to just say to people before we actually get started is there will be a topic primer that you wrote in the description. I want everyone who's watching this to pause and go read all of it right now. I think it is incredibly helpful and provides like a vast background, a good baseline for research, and good context for understanding it. That way, also, it means that we can sort of reference that material freely during the rest of this interview. So don't feel like you have to explain stuff in depth that's already in that document. And maybe that will improve our efficiency a bit. Cool. The topic we're going to be talking about today is the very likely September-October PF topic, which is that the EU should establish a nuclear sharing agreement with France to create an independent deterrent capability. So the first questions I have for you are very just like surface level bird's eye view of the topic. Like, what are the first questions that you would ask yourself if you're trying to prepare this topic, kind of agnostic to arguments at this point or agnostic to side? What's your basic thought on the topic?
So obviously, I think the first question that's a little bit specific to the topic, but is why they included the EU in the topic. This is
Yeah.
probably the thing that would irk me the most in prepping this, and still the thing I have the most questions personally about in the topic, which is just to say that if you look at the topic immediately, like the way I personally like to think about most policy type topics is like there's typically a problem, and you identify the problem, you give some basket of reasons why the problem is severe, why it can't otherwise be solved, and then you explain here's the solution. So, for example, the way I'd probably think about this topic generically is what is the problem? It's not hard to identify, it's Russia. And then the question is, what are the other ways we could deal with the problem? Will they work in deterring Russia, stopping Russian aggression? And then you try to identify, if you're pro, here's why nuclear sharing is the best or only way to stop Russian aggression. If you're con, you say, here's a bunch of reasons why it won't work or why it'll make things worse or it'll blow the world up. The first question, though, that I'd ask is like, the debate has like a weird modification, which is the EU is the intermediary that's involved in this nuclear sharing arrangement. So that's probably the first question I'd ask just in prepping it is like, well, what's the logic behind this? Admittedly, I'm not sure if I have a great answer for that, but I have some tentative thoughts. The second question that I'd ask is a little bit weirder, but I think that a really interesting way to approach topics relating to nuclear conflict is just to read a lot about cases where deterrence against nuclear armed states fails, and then try to explain why it fails. So, like for example, this is a little niche, but like if I was con on this topic, like if I knew, say, I don't know, I've drawn con and I have a week to prepare, I would spend like 5 hours just reading about the 1973 Yom Kippur War because it's an actual case of a nuclear armed country being outright invaded. And logically, that shouldn't happen. Like, if you read any deterrence theorist, pretty much ever, or any material on nuclear weapons, the logical takeaway you should have is that this conflict should not have happened. And you can find obviously other examples, Sino Soviet border skirmish, cargo war, whatever. But the point is, like, I think that an interesting place to start is to ask the question of, like, when does deterrence fail? Because this really is basically just a deterrence debate in essence. Like, pro has one way to win, which is to say, Russia boogeyman will invade. but we deter and you can't otherwise deter. And every other pro argument that I imagine people will make, like there's probably arguments like, well, otherwise Poland dashes for nukes and this is bad. It's still a deterrence argument. It's just like, do you believe this is an effective deterrent? And if it's not, the answer is Poland still dashes for nukes, for instance. So in some ways, the debate really is just a deterrence debate. And so I think the interesting way to approach it on con is to look at what are the situations in which deterrence fails and why would this be analogous? And the way I approach it or think about it more on pro is just to ask like, what are the general circumstances under which deterrence works or situations in which you effectively deter conflict? And that's a little weirder because by definition, deterrence is silent when it works in the sense that you don't see a conflict, that there is not a big fancy Wikipedia page about this war happened or this nuclear exchange occurred because it didn't happen and
Right.
deterrence was effective. So there's a weird paradox for pro on that, which is you're trying to like obviously if the Cold War, which is everyone's favorite example of nuclear weapons deterred conflict. Like last night, for example, I was reading. I didn't know this until recently, but apparently in 1969, the Soviet Union was like planning to launch a first nuclear strike against China just out of the blue, and then they backed down for slightly unknown reasons. But presumably that's a case where deterrence succeeded. But you obviously like never hear about that unless you're looking for it because it worked. So I guess that's the second question I'd ask is like basically how does deterrence theory work? The last thing I'd ask is a little odd, but I would try to get as much information as I can about Putin and like what we think Putin thinks like. And this is hard, obviously, because unless you are like working for the Kremlin and or are inside the CIA headquarters in Langley, you probably can't get a great answer to the question of what affects Putin's decision-making calculus. And at most, what you can do is you can look at Putin's past decisions and then like reverse engineer what he probably thinks. But a lot of this debate probably does end up being like, what does Putin do in response to X, where X might be nuclear sharing, it might be conventional militarization, whatever. And so it gets tricky because a lot of the debate probably, like in the real world, ends up being adjudicated by how will Putin likely respond to these policies. And this gets tricky because like no one really knows. Partially, he probably deploys madman theory. Partially, he might just be hard to read. Partially, he's also Putin, and so it gets kind of funky. And the other related thing I do to that is like there's probably a distinction between the way people think Putin operates in Western media and how he actually operates. Like there's kind of a meme that floats around in a lot of like commentary on Putin, which is until Ukraine, there was kind of this like persistent meme that Putin was like this like 4D chess master that was always a step ahead of the West, right? So it was like after the 2016 election, everyone was like, Putin engineered this whole thing and he saw this all coming. Like John Mearsheimer, who's like this, the kind of, well, he has crazy takes on Ukraine, but like he's the big IR guy who blames the West for NATO expansion. And he has this like weird take for why the Russian invasion failed. And his weird take is like, no. Putin actually wanted the invasion to fail and he wanted this protracted war in Ukraine. I think this is crazy for what it's worth. Like, no. Like he invaded, like you don't invade a country and you're like, we are going to deliberately fail and then drag a conflict out for like nearly 3 years, kill a million or injure a million of our. Anyways, the point
Wait,
is like, I'd ask the question of like, how does
is it
Putin?
like is it just bloodletting? Like the Putin is playing this 4D chess with the West to like deplete Western arsenals or something?
So Mearsheimer's argument, as I understand, to be clear, I think Mearsheimer's takes on Ukraine are kind of wild at points. But anyways, Mearsheimer's argument, I understand it, is basically if Putin was serious about capturing Ukraine, the invasion force would have been 4 to 5 times larger than it actually was. Because, well, the example he uses is like, well, when Germany invaded Poland, Germany had like 2 million soldiers, but Russia only had like 400,000 soldiers. So clearly, Russia had no intention of actually conquering Ukraine. The obvious problem with this is that all the evidence we have suggests that Putin just thought Ukraine would capitulate and surrender 3 to 4 days into the war, and you wouldn't need to literally fight for every square inch of Ukraine. That didn't happen. But I think his argument is basically Putin wanted to destabilize Ukraine enough that it would never be able to join NATO. The obvious question is like, but that was already true pre-February 2022. There was already a war in the Donbass. So, anyways, that's those are like the three ways I'd approach it. The third is probably the hardest to get a real answer to, because A, there's a lot of like narrative imposition on sources about Putin, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And also it's hard to actually know what the guy is thinking, and it gets a little weird like trying to put yourself into the position of a quasi-genocidal dictator, but so is debate.
That makes sense. Well, those are all, I think, great questions to start people's research and start getting into the core of the debate. I think it's especially pertinent what you were saying about how deterrence is kind of the core of the debate. Like, one thing that's a quirk of PF, I think, that's a bit different from a lot of other debate events, is that PFers really love, especially on the September, October topic, they love to diversify, kind of artificially. Like, no one is gonna be reading the stinky boring deterrence argument. Everyone knows deterrence. I'm gonna be reading the like Serbia argument, or something like that. And so I think it's useful to remember that there only is so much ground for that on this topic. Like most of these crazy wacko scenarios are just gonna be deterrence in disguise or by another name. So when you're prepping on either side, really keeping that in mind is going to be really crucial because the core of that debate is not something you can really escape no matter what, no matter how you label things differently. Yeah, so I think that's great advice. Um,
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that all of the like the weirder and weirder an argument gets, probably the easiest way to deal with it is just to like genuinely ask the question, would this work? Like, suppose pro runs a crazy argument, and it's like, just ask, would this work if the deterrent is ineffective or not viewed as credible? And the answer almost definitely has to be no, it would not work. I guess there are some domestic politics arguments that kind of are independent of deterrence, but ironically, the unless you run like trade arguments, I guess, like oh, Ireland withdraws from the EU and then trade collapses or whatever. Outside of that, odds are a lot of the like conflict arguments you'll make will just then link back into deterrence as their impact. Like for example, I don't know, suppose you run some crazy argument that's like, if we do this, then like the AfD wins in Germany and like the far right gains power in the Bundestag and this is bad or whatever. But like probably one of the main impacts you would then make is like, oh, but what is the effect on conflict or what is the effect on deterrence? And so then you've just looped your way back into the original deterrence debate, just more complicatedly. So
Right, yeah. It's interesting. We definitely will see things like that though. So it's funny that you bring it up. Like already people are farming different EU nations. I mean, most obviously France and any host states for like different politics scenarios, in an attempt to just like run away from as much of the clash on deterrence as possible.
yeah.
But
But
we'll
like even like the France argument, like I think that there's like a really clever way. Like this is I think the really kind of cracked con strategy is you couple like you run one argument which is like the nuclear sharing arrangement probably takes several years to build effectively, in the sense of like you have to deploy, you have to train, you have to build your deterrence posture and so forth. Then you run a domestic politics argument which is like probably the national rally wins in 2027. And then you run an argument which is if the national rally wins in 27, then no one thinks the deterrent is credible because all the rhetoric coming from France will be very hostile to this. So by the time the nuclear sharing arrangement goes into effect, it's lost all credibility because of the electoral politics outcome. But I think that that requires a bit of link work, but it's not hard to prove. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I told you before we started the recording, but this is one of the reasons I think the topic is a bit con biased structurally, is because even if in truth it is not, which I'm a bit skeptical of as well, in structure it feels like it might be, just because like pro relies on proving one central claim, whereas con has multiple paths to disproving that claim. So it's like, for example, there's not really much of a risk for con to like on the side have this French politics prerequisite that like if it's not handled very well, well, there you go. It's very difficult for the pro to win. But if it is handled very well, well, that's okay. You can like time suck them a little bit and then just go for the other arguments that have the same effect.
yeah, I agree. That's probably what like con has a lot of easy cheap shot ways to win, which is you just identify conditions for pro's argument to work, and then you just kind of attack them one by one deliberately, which makes it kind of hard for pro because presumably pro's playing kind of defense for a lot of the round, like just being like, no, this attack won't work, or this domestic politics argument won't work, etc. So my personal thought on how pro deals with this is like, I think it's kind of odd, but I think pro just needs to spend a lot of time, like even just in prep, like really convincing yourself that it would be like the end of the world if Russia invaded Estonia or Lithuania or Poland or whatever. And like in the same way that people typically are terrified of like nuclear war scenarios, right? Like most people kind of have this intuition generally, which is if nukes get used, that is horrifying. Like, oh my God, like what's going to happen next? Is the world going to get blown up? I think if you're pro, like the mindset you kind of need to have is almost that, which is there is going to be an invasion of a sovereign NATO-aligned country in the next 5 to 10 years, and we are powerless to stop it. And this is like the last chance we have to deal with it. Yeah, maybe it won't work. Yeah, maybe, Marie Le Pen's gonna be thrilled because now the RN crushes in France, whatever. But I think if you're like pro, the mindset you need to have is almost like like oh my God, like we are kind of cooked right now, and we got to do something to stop a Russian invasion. And if you really believe that the stakes are that bad, then maybe this does look like a pretty good idea. Because hey, if it fails, okay, whatever, a couple of far right parties win in Europe. But if you succeed, you stop like a potentially World War III type scenario. So it's kind of like expected value calculus stuff, where it's like maybe there is a 20% chance Russia invades, and maybe there's a 5% chance that deterrence works only on pro. And maybe like the 95% outcome is con, but the 5% case that pro wins is like we potentially stop I was about to say intergalactic, but it would not be an intergalactic war, like an intercontinental like conflict with the potential to go nuclear. And so that impact probably does matter more. The issue, of course, is that a smart con team just finds a way to link whatever argument they've run into conflict or into war or into nuclear escalation.
Yeah.
And then the way doesn't work.
Yeah, it's all too common these days in PF. But we'll get to this in due time. So the next question I want to ask you about the resolution is like, what is it actually likely to look like if you were? I mean, we don't have like a model in the same way as BP. We don't have fiat power, even though this is like a policy style topic. So we have to sort of guess what it likely would look like. But what do you think are the conditions around that?
So my guess is that you'd have several years of before you even actually do anything, you would just have like a lot of kind of public discourse justifying why this is a smart thing for France to do, which sounds boring, but I actually think it's probably important strategically if you're pro to run this because you need some sort of mitigatory measure against all of the con backlash arguments. I think there's a fair way that pro says, look, a lot of people's opinions about foreign policy are elite driven in the sense that most people don't come to their own beliefs about foreign policy. They instead listen to whatever the people in power or the think tanks or the media establishments are saying and kind of internalize that. Like a really terrible example that you definitely don't want to use as pro because everyone's going to be like, why are you defending that? But I read like a thing a while ago, like this is kind of how like the Iraq war happened in the sense that like if you polled Americans and like, even after 9/11 and you were like, do you support the US invading Iraq? It would have been like 9 to 15% or whatever saying those are very specific numbers, but it would be like very like low percent, not because people opposed it, but because no one had heard the positive case for doing it. But over time, like if you have a bunch of influential people kind of building the case, then it kind of works. So I think pros probably like most realistic implementation is a lot of time of Macron kind of being like, y'all, this is a pretty chill idea. Don't worry, it's going to be good for French security and so forth. And you could arguably say you can't even really say he's tried to do this. He's made the most abstract of abstract statements about extending the kind of confines of France's nuclear umbrella. But anyways, I think after that, the most likely scenario is you probably forward deploy maybe several dozen at most airborne warheads in some Eastern European country. Germany is sometimes floated. I think my personal take is it would be very dumb for Pro to try to say Germany is the realistic candidate, mostly because the obvious candidates for Russian attack are not Germany, because Germany does not directly border Russia. So it seems a bit odd, like if you were just like, we will station them in Germany, then it seems like you've just limited Pro's deterrence arguments a lot because Estonia is not looking nuclear protected all that much if Germany has nukes. Plus, you can still make arguments why a non-credible U.S. forward-deployed nuclear arsenal in Germany is sufficient. Anyways, so I think the most realistic case is probably Poland. Some people could try to say the Baltics. It seems unlikely. And you would have to do all three of the Baltics, presumably. Like, you probably can't just be like, Lithuania gets nukes, because then, poor Latvia and Estonia are like, but what about us? So I think the most likely candidate is Poland. And this makes sense. Like, Poland's probably like statistically the largest percent of GDP defense spender. They clearly are concerned about Russian aggression. There's a history of war with Russia. So this seems like a reasonable candidate for nuclear sharing. The question then is, how does it work? So my guess is you probably have you pick 3 to 4 Polish air bases. You forward deploy a couple of French weapons. You probably have a tripwire force deployed as well. So you probably have a few thousand French soldiers put in place there. Um, you probably also have some role that Polish military service people play in like the maintenance of the arsenal, training drills with the weapons, stuff like that. But obviously, France ultimately retains control. The EU's role gets a little bit funky. I imagine that probably if you're pro, the characterization you want to push is that the EU doesn't have that much bureaucratic involvement in this, and it's more of like a kind of symbolic arrangement between the EU and France. Mostly because the more and more steps you add onto under what conditions would you deploy nukes, the less and less credible the deterrent actually is. And there's like a weird relationship where ideally the world would be a better place if we believed there was an exactly 0% chance nukes ever get used. But this would mean that nukes have no power. So we need there to be a non-zero probability that nukes get used. But like we're all scared of that possibility because that means nuclear war. So the probability has to be low, but not too low for it to lose deterrence ability. And the concern is if the EU has a bunch of like, suppose the EU needs to sign off at like 5 different levels before you deploy any nuclear weapons in Poland or Estonia or Finland or whatever, then you probably undermine the deterrence posture. And it seems unlikely anyways. Although I guess the EU does love bureaucracy. So maybe there's some con claim, which is like, nah, the EU is going to staff 17 different agencies and 8 different like veto steps before anything gets used. So I think that the most likely outcome is the EU has some sort of symbolic, superficial role, almost in like the way that the EU currently is involved in militarization, which is to say the EU passes these kind of grand sounding laws and not laws, but like kind of proposals for militarization. But if you actually dig into what they're doing, it's basically just you, the member state, will spend more on defense. And the EU pats itself on the back and says, good job, guys. We told our member states they should spend more on defense. But it's really the member states doing all the grunt work. So I think that's probably the most likely outcome for the EU that you want to push on pro. Then the key question is like, what is the deterrence sort of posture / what is the stated nuclear doctrine for forward deployed nuclear weapons? And does that align perfectly with the actual doctrine that France would use? So this is where things get tricky for a couple of reasons. One of them is that because France does not have tactical nukes, you really can't offer any sort of credible, we will deploy nuclear weapons on a kind of tactical level. So it has to be, we will only use nuclear weapons as an escalatory tool. The other thing that makes it a little tricky to figure out what the deterrence posture should look like is a lot of the like real world arguments for nuclear sharing are not we need Poland to have nuclear weapons stationed on its territory to deter Russia, but more we need to stop Russia from being able to use nuclear blackmailing. Like we need to be able to neutralize Putin's nuclear saber rattling that he loves to do in Ukraine, which is just to say every time the West is like, we will give this fancy new weapon system to Ukraine, Putin says, but I will blow up Washington, D.C. in thermonuclear ash. And then even though the U.S. doesn't say they're scared by it, they are scared by it and they delay 6 months and they put a bunch of restrictions on the weapon system and so forth. So probably the real world argument that like people make for why nuclear forward deployment works or is good is you incapacitate nuclear saber rattling because at least now the West has a credible nuclear deterrent in place. The issue, of course, is you still need to figure out like under what circumstances would these be used. My guess is that the most likely outcome is it's the least aggressive possible posture, which is just to say you probably would have it be like if Poland's existence were on the line, you would probably involve nuclear weapons, or if some loosely defined French national interest or national essence were on the line, you would attack. The other thing that theoretically could happen is you might have some like strategic ambiguity posture of kind of what France somewhat has now, which is you sort of use one of the weird abstract terms that no one really knows how to define, like national essence or national interest, and then leave it up to be. The problem is, I think this puts pro in a bad double bind if you push that characterization. And the double bind is, in order for pro to say the risk of Russian escalation is credible or Russian aggression is credible, you sort of need to establish that Putin is a sufficiently risk-tolerant leader that he would invade a NATO country. The problem is if that characterization is true, that Putin is very risk-tolerant, then a strategic ambiguity posture would probably not be an effective deterrent because the whole premise of strategic ambiguity is that a risk-averse leader is scared because there is the potential, the unknown possibility that nuclear weapons get get deployed. But if Putin is sufficiently risk tolerant that the pro characterization on Russian invasion is true, then strategic ambiguity probably fails. And then in that case, pro is definitely cooked because either the deterrence just fails or you have to honor the nuclear commitment, in which case, congratulations, you've just started a nuclear war against the world's largest nuclear power, which is probably bad. The other implication of the double bind is maybe in theory you can prove that Putin would be deterred by strategic ambiguity, but then a smart con team just says, congratulations, you've just conceded that Putin is risk tolerant. Here's a bunch of reasons why the risk is already very high of invading Poland. Hence, Putin will not invade Poland, and your case is self-defeated. So I think the most plausible characterization is forward deployment of maybe 24 nuclear weapons, airborne. For what it's worth, that is probably unfortunate. I think there's a really odd but interesting conventional counterforce argument on Khan, which is like Russia might, like the last 2 months, this is a very niche side tangent, so I'll give it like 20 seconds. But the last 2 months has arguably demonstrated that conventional counterforce is possible. So historically, the belief was that counterforce requires nuclear weapons. Like you can't destroy an enemy's arsenal unless you use nuclear weapons. Like no one, for example, thought the US could eliminate the Soviet arsenal by just dropping some regular bombs. It would have to be a nuclear attack. Arguably, this has changed in that high precision weapons make conventional strikes capable of eliminating an enemy's arsenal. So Ukraine did this somewhat famously to Russia about a month and a half ago, where they used drones to hit Russian strategic bombers. People flipped out about this and were like, Ukraine's trying to start nuclear war. No, they hit like a few dozen strategic bombers. This is not eliminating Russia's 5,000 plus nuclear weapons. But that coupled with the Iran strikes, where depending on what sources you look at, the US arguably did a lot of damage to a heavily fortified underground bunker through, again, conventional means, might make it possible that a airborne nuclear deterrent could theoretically be incapacitated through conventional Russian attacks. Maybe there's a con argument there. It gets a little funky. I only mention that because if Pro could just be like, yeah, we'll build a silo outside of Warsaw. That probably solves the problem, but you can't build a silo outside of Warsaw, so that seems implausible. In any case, that's, I think, the most likely characterization is basically it's the least possible aggressive deterrence posture that you can get, and anything more aggressive almost certainly backfires for Pro because a smart con team says no one thinks this is credible, it's not going to work, and then Pro is probably cooked.
That makes sense. I have 5 questions. Question one is very simple, actually. So I want to talk about red lines versus strategic ambiguity. Some people, I think, maybe have a misunderstanding. As far as I'm aware, at camp, you can like see people's arguments on the wiki. There's some arguments about strategic ambiguity, but I want to clarify, neither a red line doctrine nor a strategic ambiguity doctrine is entailed by the resolution. Like it could be either, right? Uh,
Yeah, it could fully be either. And you could arguably say not you can't have both, but like there isn't you could theoretically say there's a red line, but secretly you could be unclear internally as to whether or not you'll honor the red line. Just because, theoretically red lines can be not enforced. But that's obviously a weird posture to take, so you probably don't want to do that. But yeah, it's fully open which of those two things you'd have.
Right, that makes sense. Because strategic ambiguity could still be part of the nuclear sharing. It's just like you're ambiguous as to what counts as a condition under which you would launch the nuclear missiles.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's like there is a red line somewhere. You just haven't said where the red line is. Like this is the classic example is Taiwan, where it's like the U.S. has arguably shifted away from it in Taiwan, but it's like the U.S. will never say, "Aha, we will defend Taiwan in the event of an attack." Everyone thinks that's true, but the U.S. never says it. So there is a red line somewhere. Like there is some file deep in the Pentagon where it's like, if this thing happens, then deploy the U.S. military. The question is, no one knows what that thing is unless you have
right.
level infinite security clearance underneath the deep layers of the Pentagon.
That makes sense. Question number two then is you said that strategic ambiguity might backfire for the pro because Putin is a pretty risk-tolerant leader, and risk-tolerant leaders will maybe doubt the strategic ambiguity anyway and just attack. I was wondering, why is that unique for strategic ambiguity? Why wouldn't the same be true for a red line? Like, for example, if France says, we will nuke Moscow if you cross the Suwalki Gap, right? Then Russia or Putin just might be like, no, you won't. And then,
Yeah, fair.
um,
So I guess the distinction is there's a question of credibility that affects any nuclear doctrine, which is does Putin think that the threat is credible of nuclear escalation? And then there's a second question, which is if you have a strategic ambiguity posture, theoretically Putin can try to engage in red line testing in that he believes there is a red line somewhere that if it was violated, it would trigger nuclear escalation. But the point is that the logic of strategic ambiguity is that you have a very weak red line in the sense that like a really bad thing would have to happen to trigger escalation, but you try to make it seem in reality like a much lesser form of escalation would trigger the retaliation. So the logic of strategic ambiguity, for example, might be in reality, France will only use nuclear weapons under the specific condition that Poland is about to be wiped off the map. But strategic ambiguity could be interpreted by Russia as if we so much as attack Poland, then Moscow gets nuked or whatever, Siberia's oil fields go ploof. In that case, theoretically, the logic of strategic ambiguity is like the actual quote unquote line that's being drawn is much higher, but you're trying to convince Russia it's lower than it actually is. But theoretically, if you have a sufficiently risk-tolerant leader, they will call the bluff and say, you are trying to be strategically ambiguous about where the red line is drawn. I think it's actually much higher than you are pretending. And because I think it's much higher than you are pretending through your bluff, I'll call the bluff and assume you're not serious about following through on it. The issue is if you think Putin is a sufficiently risk-tolerant leader, he might believe that there is a credible threat of nuclear escalation. He just thinks that he will not trigger the threat of nuclear escalation because the quote-unquote actual red line won't be breached. And
Right.
France is trying to bluff him into thinking it's lower than it is.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So then the question, I guess, is like, why would a red line work against him if he's like this?
So there's probably a few things. I mean, I think one is you probably can just make a claim that even if Putin is irrational or paranoid, or some people think he has Parkinson's, is this like random crazy theory that people have thrown around because he has like every time he's in public, his hands are really shaky. There's a bazillion theories about his health, but probably you can make a fair claim, which is that like Putin is at the end of the day self-interested and sufficiently risk tolerant that even a 10% chance of his own nuclear annihilation would be sufficient to deter him. There's
Mhm.
kind of like a joke in the Cold War, which is that like the Soviet Union just needed to believe there was like a 5% chance of escalation to be deterred, whereas every EU country was like, you need to be 95% sure that that you're going to retaliate. So I think basically the key question ends up being like roughly speaking, how risk averse is Putin, and also how accurate is the information that's getting to Putin. I was trying to think about this the other day. So there's one potential argument for why on con deterrence fails, which is, well, Putin is surrounded by yes men who just feed Putin the information he wants to hear. He probably has bad information flows, and this is fair. The issue is, I think it nukes the bad word, but it kind of blows up the debate for both sides because if you think that Putin is completely irrational and can't be deterred, then I guess con runs this. But it's really odd because if you really believe that Putin is crazy risk tolerant and crazy irrational, he might just invade Poland anyways on either side. And I guess Khan can run that and be like, yeah, screw it. We think Poland's going down. We may as well not nuke the world while doing it. But this seems like probably an inferior con strat. But the issue of whether Putin is sufficiently risk tolerant that the red line works, I think it's probably fair to say that he is. You can probably find historical evidence for like Putin does respond to threats. In the sense that like Putin is not nearly as crazy radical as people say, or kind of fearmonger about him. I mean, there's like a really boring argument, but like he hasn't, for example, directly breached NATO or attempted to get NATO to invoke Article 5. You could even make an argument that like if you think about the way that Putin has historically approached Georgia or Ukraine even, it's very, very centered around red line testing, but he's clearly afraid of actually breaching the red line. Like, if you think about Ukraine, you start with election interference for several years. You gradually escalate to like partially annexing one part of the country in Crimea, a very limited war that Putin initially denies involvement in and later says, actually, we were involved in the Donbass war. And then you eventually, over the course of like 15 years, build up to a conventional war. This doesn't seem like evidence of a person who is crazy risk tolerant, and it more seems evidence of a person who is afraid that there is a red line and doesn't want to cross it until he's very convinced of it.
Right.
So I think the way that to push it on pro is like, we actually do have evidence of this. The other claim that you might make for this that is again, hard to prove because we just don't know the exact internal politicking of the Kremlin. But Putin is a personalist dictatorship, but there are like military people around him who would have reason to be very scared of nuclear escalation. And it's very plausible that even though Putin is a powerful and personalist autocrat, that the people around him still do have influence, both in controlling what information he gets and also in signing off on all of the actual orders. Like, every dictator is potentially vulnerable to a coup of some kind. And like, even if you just think like historically, there are plenty of leaders of nuclear armed states who on paper should have been extraordinarily risk tolerant. Like the things Mao said about nuclear weapons are like low key terrifying. Like he kind of thought more or less they were kind of bluffs and you could just attack a nuclear armed state and hey, whatever, the world's going to be fine. So in theory, you could have picked any one of those leaders and said, why didn't they, for example, start a nuclear war? And probably part of the answer is because the people in their militaries or the people in their general staffs or the people actually controlling the invasion forces do have enough influence that if a dictator is going to do something truly suicidal, they intervene and say, yeah, this is a bad idea, bro. So potentially there's one way to do it, which is like maybe you can find evidence that the senior elites in the Kremlin slash military are basically, as long as they're afraid enough for their life, they probably don't want to risk it. In the sense that even if there is the potential for nuclear escalation, that works. The other thing that you could try to do is Nina Tannenwald is, I think she's actually at Brown. She's like,
He was my
she's kind
professor.
of, oh, that's great. She's like kind of the like world expert, I suppose, on like kind of like constructivist arguments around nukes and the nuclear taboo. Um, there's probably an argument somehow relating to that, which is a little hard because Russia might be the clearest evidence the nuclear taboo isn't working because Russia currently is the country most willing to threaten nuclear use in a way that no other country previously did. But it is possible that leaders are so terrified of nuclear weapons that they just genuinely would not conceive of doing something which risks nuclear escalation. And you might be able to make a constructivist argument of some kind here, which is regardless of how credible the risk is, people are terrified of even the small, minute possibility of nuclear war in a way that is very distinct from any risk calculus. Like people just are horrified by the idea that their entire life could just be obliterated in a second by a nuclear strike. And so potentially there's a claim there, which is just that regardless of how risk tolerant you are, nukes are just different in the sense of even if Putin is not afraid of sanctions, not afraid of conventional war. Like there's just psychologically something distinct about nuclear weapons in a way that a red line would work reasonably. So those are all potential ways to prove that the red line theoretically works. And probably if you add some sort of like tripwire force analysis, this might strengthen the kind of red line analysis. Because like, the logic of a tripwire force in theory is like, well, if France has, say, 5,000 soldiers in Poland and they all get killed, then there's going to be outrage from France. And even if there's a far right government, in theory, there would still be outrage. And this potentially triggers a response. It's hard to prove it would be a nuclear response. Like, I've never seen a person seriously say, for example, that if all of the US tripwire forces in South Korea got killed, the US would say it's time to nuke Pyongyang. But you probably can make some argument why the risk of escalation is sufficient, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's actually a good segue because my third question is you talked about and you kind of like explained reasons for why the candidate is likely more going to be Poland than Germany, for instance. The EU is likely not going to be that involved, and the posture is likely going to be something like this that's maybe more of a red line, but definitely less escalatory. There's one step that I think was very reasonable, but I didn't hear as much explanation for, which is like literally it will be air bases and
Oh,
we'll
yeah.
have the nukes there and we'll have a tripwire force. So my question is like, it seems like technically a nuclear sharing agreement does not necessarily entail all of these things. You can have a nuclear sharing agreement in name without actually having the nukes based in another country, for instance. So my question is just like, why is this going to be the most likely implementation?
So my guess it's mostly a matter of like if you're going to establish a nuclear sharing arrangement, the explicit aim or purpose is deterring conflict against that country. Now, in theory, you could just redraw the French national doctrine to say, like, Poland is now included in our nuclear umbrella, and as a consequence, any attack will be interpreted as an attack on France and will trigger a nuclear response. Potentially, the risk with this is like the distinction between not deploying and deploying is just a matter of like signaling, which is to say, deploying is a signal of credible commitment to use the force. Like the actual military purposes is useless. Like there's no real reason why you like the nuke needs to be in Poland but not in France. It's not like the missile can't reach Russia from France, but it can in Poland. So probably the logic behind why you would deploy it in Poland is mostly a signaling matter, which is obviously every person who thinks about nuclear weapons knows the big issue is credibility for extended deterrence. And so the question is, how do you answer the extended deterrence problem? And one of the ways you do it is you put nuclear weapons on the country's soil. Like, would the United States actually risk nuclear war to defend Turkey? Almost definitely not. But the US tries to bluff it would by forward deploying nukes in Turkey. So one reason is just a signaling matter, which is if France is serious about doing this nuclear sharing stuff, it would make more sense to deploy than not, just from a signaling perspective. The other reason is if you are serious about the stopping Poland from nuclearizing on its own, which I personally think is an implausible scenario, but possible, just like low probability. It probably does make more sense to actually station in Poland or whatever country you've picked. Part of the logic, specifically in nuclear sharing as opposed to extended deterrence generally, is that the country has some very limited role in like maintenance of the arsenal, training in the arsenal. Does this actually matter in practice? No, not really, in the sense of like, it's very sweet to say, the Polish military now knows how to, refurbish these nice missiles, and it knows how to refuel them and put gas in the airplane. Does this actually change the balance of power? No, not at all. But it's a signal. So you could probably make a claim which is like signals matter a lot for credibility, and that's why you would forward deploy. Why it has to be airborne? Well, the issue is like France eliminated its land-based missiles, which seems unideal, and you probably would not love the idea of putting like a nuclear-armed submarine near Poland directly. And even if you did, it would be like just put it in the Atlantic Ocean. But if you're going to put it in like a big ocean, then at that point in time, it's basically the same thing as just saying that Poland is included in our nuclear sort of deterrent broadly. So there's no real distinction. That's my personal read. Obviously, you can theoretically push like, no, it'll actually be much lesser. Like it might just be France redraws or like rewrites its nuclear doctrine and says an attack on Poland will be considered an attack on French national interests. And that's fine. But the softer and softer of a stance you take on pro, in the sense of like the less and less involved it is, then you kind of lock yourself somewhat into a double bind, which is like you then need to prove this is sufficient to deter Russia meaningfully. But the less and less credible the deterrent, the more and more risk averse you would need to believe Putin is. And the more and more risk averse Putin is, the less and less need there is for a nuclear deterrent,
Right.
logically.
Yeah.
So you sort of need this like weird, like it's this weird like equilibrium you need to prove, which is Putin is risk averse enough. Risk tolerant enough. He'll invade on Khan, but not risk tolerant enough that he won't think the deterrent is scary. And so he'll actually listen to it. So that's why I think you probably want to push the signaling stuff, but that's my personal read.
Yeah, that makes sense. This actually is very a good transition again into my last two questions on this, which is like, it seems like there's two ways to resolve this maybe, or two questions about this at least. One way to resolve it is if we can separate the pro world from the con world as much as possible, then we escape some of this double bind. So for instance, do you think that there is an argument to be made that the pro entails an expansion of the French arsenal? You were talking, for instance, earlier
Yeah.
France only has strategic weapons right now. There has never been a nuclear sharing arrangement with strategic weapons, and so maybe they would expand into tactical weapons, or at least, like in general, invest more in innovating and modernizing their nuclear warheads above and beyond the current trajectory. Do you think that's plausible? If so, why? If not, why not? And do you think it like
So
addresses this at all?
I think it's plausible. Like it's not that hard to build, a tactical warhead as opposed to a strategic warhead. I say that as if I can do it, like, oh, let's hop into my garage, guys, and let me tinker around a little bit. But like, it really is not like it's not a technically difficult feat. It's more just a matter of actually doing it. I think the potential. It certainly seems likely that if this were to happen, France would invest a lot in its nuclear arsenal. The most boring reason is just like if you are now suppose France says we're going to station 30 tactical or strategic warheads in Poland. Poland, then like logically France would want an additional 30 to replenish its own domestic stockpile. So probably like this would involve some level of nuclear modernization in France. And this is also consistent with like China is modernizing its arsenal on a vast scale. The US is doing it as well. The slight issue is it's a really boring thing, and it's like if you're not interested in nuclear like weapons, this is like the stupid stuff, but like this stuff takes an enormous amount of time and it takes an annoying amount of money. Like the US, for example, is doing this big $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization stuff. And like it's so for example, it's building these new missiles, the Sentinel-3, to carry its ICB as like new ICBMs. And like it just keeps running over. Like they keep saying like we're gonna have the missile guys, we're gonna have the missile guys, or the warhead design is almost finished, and then they're like, we just need another 6 months, or it's another year. So it's a on its own that's unimportant. The reason it's arguably important is like there does become a weird timeline issue at play here, which is presumably most people, I would guess, don't think that this is a debate about trying to stop an invasion in 50 years. Like most people's concern is we think there will be an invasion in like 2029, or like maybe the war in Ukraine ends in 2026, and in 2028 Putin says we're rolling out the tanks into Latvia, or we're rolling out the tanks, into Poland or whatever. And so the problem is it's fine for Pro to say, well, the likely implementation of this is that France develops a land-based component of its nuclear triad, or, develops strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. The issue is like a boring time question, which is, but if the invasion starts in 2028 and you're not going to have the tactical nukes till
Yeah.
2031, does this work? I guess I'm going to guess that there's no or very few sources I would imagine that are credible on like, here's the timeline it would take for France to build tactical nukes. I would guess what you could probably try to do is like look at the US case, and like if I were Khan, for example, you might be able to cut a card that's like, well, the US took X years to, I don't know, modernize its arsenal in this way, and France will probably take even longer. And so there might be a timeline issue at play here. It's a boring issue, but it actually does probably matter. But
Mhm.
yeah, the likely answer is this probably would happen, at least in some capacity. What you
And
might also theoretically see is you might see like a multiple phase nuclear sharing arrangement where maybe phase one is France rewrites its nuclear doctrine to say Poland is now included under the French nuclear umbrella. 5 years later, assuming the world hasn't blown up by then France says, now that we have tactical nukes, we'll now station a couple of tactical nukes on Polish soil. Maybe after that, you eventually escalate it, and now Poland has direct influence over the nuclear art, whatever it happens to be. So you might gradually build this up. Again, the timeline issue becomes weird, which is that
yeah.
logically the threat is now. So the more and more you say, well, in 5 years we'll do this, or in 10 years we'll do that, it becomes increasingly hard. The other reason it gets weird is you probably can make an interesting argument on Khan, which is like a preemptive war claim, which is so there's like a big school of thought, which is like the war in Ukraine was a preventive strike against Ukraine because Russia's fear was that Ukraine at some point becomes a NATO state, and this is very bad for Russian security. There might be an interesting argument, which is suppose France came out tomorrow and said in 10 years, in 2035, we will put French tactical weapons on Polish soil. Suppose Russia buys all of the arguments for why this would be like all the pro arguments for why, oh, once Poland has tactical nukes on its soil, it is unthinkable for Russia to invade. This arguably makes the risk of war in the next 10 years much more likely because
Right.
before the tactical nukes get deployed, there's an opportunity to attack.
Yeah.
So you need some window in that like intermediate time, right? Which is before you get the tactical nukes deployed, how do you deter conflict? Like this is the Iran issue, right? Like Iran's problem was if Iran had nuclear weapons, does Iran get hit by Israel? Absolutely not, because you get the logic of MAD and all of that. But because there was a window of you are trying to get, well, maybe possibly trying to get nukes, but haven't yet got them, there's an opportunity to attack and there's an incentive to attack, which is
Right.
the balance of power will shift massively once the window has closed. So you have to do it now. So you might do a weird claim on Khan, which is we think Putin, I don't think you want to say he's a chill guy, but we don't think Putin has serious ambitions to take Poland. However, once you do this, now if they're like suppose Putin, I don't know, once every 7 days wakes up and is like, oh, maybe we should take Poland. But it's not a serious interest. It's not a major concern. But now you've given him a reason why you can't wait 10 years to do it and you have to do it now. And you theoretically might have to, whatever, intervene at the time. I have this personal. This is a side tangent, so you can cut me off. This is if this is too boring. So I have this personal side tangent, like this personal philosophy. I've never found any source that says it, so you probably shouldn't trust it because if some random dude on the internet says it, it's probably not true. So like the worst like strategic day in Russian history was June 22nd, 1941, which is Barbarossa, which is when Germany attacks the Soviet Union. And the reason it's terrible is because like you have Molotov-Ribbentrop, it fails, and suddenly Germany attacks. So I have this theory that Putin like believes seriously that this is like the worst day in Russian history. I mean, maybe not like literally that, but like Putin's family personally was devastated by the German invasion of the Soviet Union. He wasn't born until after the war, but like several of his like family members died or were killed during the war. And there's like a widespread consensus in like Russian security politics that like this was the worst. Like arguably signing the non-aggression pact with Germany was maybe the worst thing. Well, I mean, Stalin, killed millions of people, so that is probably on a direct intentionality basis worse. But from a strategic perspective, probably the worst thing the Soviet Union did from a foreign policy perspective. And arguably, this is maybe why the Russian leadership has always been so paranoid about Western expansion into Eastern Europe, which is they waited too long to do anything about Germany, or they didn't take the German threat seriously enough. And then June 22nd happens, and you get attacked, and tens of millions of Soviets die in the war. And Putin probably believes this personally himself. He's maybe enough of a scholar of history. I hate saying a scholar of history in reference to Putin, but he understands the history well enough that this is probably a concern. Suppose you are Putin and you genuinely believe the worst thing that happened in Russian history was the German invasion. The logic for why this happened was that the Soviet Union did not take this threat seriously enough, and it waited too long to do anything about it. And by the time the Soviet Union realized that anything could potentially go astray in the Soviet-German relationship, half of the Soviet Union is under attack, and World War II on the Eastern Front has begun. Arguably, the same logic applies here, which is if you're Putin, suppose you're pushing the Khan argument, you see the introduction of French nuclear weapons onto Poland or Estonia or Finland or whatever it happens to be. Maybe you get flashbacks to 1941 a little bit, and you're like, this is like the seeds of World War II all over again. We're letting our army or our enemy build up their military right in our backyard. We were too weak to do anything about it in the past when NATO expanded into the Baltics, but this time we can do something. Is that how Putin thinks? I have no idea. If I did know how that's Putin thinking, I would not be talking to you. I'd be buried at the CIA under like 7 layers of bureaucracy, like unable to speak to anyone. But like that's potentially a very convoluted psychological like way of thinking about this, which is the World War II specifics important? No. But the general takeaway might be, which is if you are really scared that the balance of power will shift disfavorably for Russia, you attack now.
That makes sense. So, to sort of piggyback on that a little bit, my fifth question, my fifth follow-up on this, was about the comparative. Like, what do you think is going to happen instead if France does not engage in a nuclear sharing agreement? Do you think that other thing would also produce similar effects on Putin, or what do you think it would or would not look like?
So obviously it has to be something conventional in the sense of like if you don't do so like there's one potential counterfactual, which is well, Poland goes for nukes on their own. I don't know. Probably the way this debate gets funky is pro cuts a card that says Poland wants nukes, and con cuts a card that says Poland doesn't want nukes. And the only sensible takeaway by the end of the debate is there is some possibility that Poland will want to get nukes. My guess is this actually it falls back into the other debate about deterrence because if Poland, like, Polish policymakers are actually not dumb and presumably realize smartly that there are credibility concerns over the French arsenal and forward deployment. So presumably all of the arguments on whether Poland gets nukes are secretly just arguments as to whether or not this is a credible deterrent on pro. Like there might just be a fine way on con to say, look, they've read a card that says, Poland's going to get nukes. Maybe, but they might just get nukes anyways because, you get no real benefit from nuclear sharing. In terms of what France does, so my guess is that France continues roughly what it's doing now, which is to say very heavily encouraging EU militarization and building up military forces, particularly in Eastern Europe. Like there's this really funny tweet, I can find it now, but like Macron, like a few weeks back, put out this like funny tweet, which was, it's like a tweet of like one of the French fighter jets, and it's like the design of like EU, you have an incoming phone call, and it's like the name of the company that makes the jet. And like Macron just posted this on Twitter, and he was like, "Guys, you need to wake up! Like you're being called to militarize." But this probably is realistically the French path forward, which is to say, supporting large-scale militarization, particularly in the Baltics, particularly in Poland, encouraging countries in Southern Europe as well, Western Europe as well, that have historically been reluctant to spend more on defense to do so. Partially, this is like an endogenous preference of France to militarize the EU. There's also a financial angle to it, which is that a lot of those contracts end up going to French military contractors. So it naturally makes sense that if you're a French aircraft corporation, you'd just be giddy if every European country decided to double their aircraft forces. Part of it might be an exogenous concern, which is like, the concern that the U.S. is like, I do not know if Trump really thinks he is quote unquote NATO's daddy, but if he does, then you probably do, as France, want NATO to spend more on defense as it's kind of committed to do so. So this seems like the most intuitive answer. The question that gets more interesting is like, what are the specific things France would do beyond just generically say, build up your militaries? Like, for example, would France deploy large numbers of soldiers to Eastern Europe in a bid to sort of cement its like deterrence posture? And the answer is possibly. Like maybe it's possible, for instance, that France says we're going to do extensive joint training exercises with the Polish military and the Lithuanian military and the Finnish military. We're going to supply them with, anti-tank missiles and drones and all of this in a bid to kind of strengthen Europe's deterrence posture. The question of whether this triggers Russian escalation is interesting. I think it gets kind of funky because, like, logically, it shouldn't be more escalatory than nukes in the sense that
Right.
logically, like there is nothing more escalatory than nuclear weapons. That being said, there might be a potential claim, which is like, ironically, on a probability level, the probability that French soldiers would be used in like a Polish-Russian war is way higher, for instance, than the probability that French nuclear weapons would be used in a
Right.
Polish-Russian war. So there might be an ironic way, like it's very odd for pro to say this, but I guess there's a weird pro argument, which is that if the alternative to French nuclear sharing is France puts 50,000 soldiers in Poland, for instance, or does a bunch of joint training exercises. This might arguably irk Putin more because the threat to Russia is greater, because the probability of French involvement is higher. The obvious problem is like, if you're pro, you still need to make Putin believe that there is a sufficient risk that nuclear weapons get used, which is obviously more escalatory or more denialist than conventional forces, and that kind of gets tricky. I think the real honest issue with this argument, though, is like it kind of assumes this fake way that political capital works, where it's like Macron has 100 units of kind of political power, and he can either go to the store called nuclear sharing and spend his 100 units of political capital on that, or he can do it on this other thing. And the more honest answer is it would probably be some combination of both, i.e., suppose France puts nuclear weapons in Poland, or suppose it just rewrites its nuclear doctrine to say Poland's covered. The likely outcome is you also deploy forces to Poland to complement those forces. And in fact, Pro would want to say this because you want to establish credibility by doing lots of joint training and arms sales and intelligence sharing and putting soldiers on the ground as tripwire forces. So it gets a little weird because Pro logically doesn't probably want to concede a huge trade-off. At most, maybe Pro says the risk of miscalculation is higher in Khan's world. So, for example, maybe on both sides, France has some military presence in Eastern Europe, but there's a greater risk that, for example, a drone accidentally breaches Russia's borders in Khan's world if France has to put double the number of drones in Eastern Europe to signal its deterrence commitment, and maybe that increases the risk of conflict. But probably that's the realistic counterfactual answer: is continued conventional military buildup.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, I want to speed through like a few of these next questions
Okay,
because
I'll be speedy.
I do want you to give a BP speech for me as
Oh
the
yes, yes.
at the end of this. Um, I'll tell you a little bit about what I want from that. But first, a few more like sort of just logistical questions about the resolution. The next one is about the EU, because I share your sort of like why is the EU here? It seems like it does stick out like a sore thumb. So my question for you is, what does the EU actually do day to day right now? Like, what are its normal functions, and how might they be affected, if at all, by the resolution?
Yeah, so The reason I think the EU at the day-to-day level is odd in this is that the EU has historically been primarily a political and economic body and not a security body. And that's why the like NATO EU distinction has historically been pretty compelling, which is that the EU has lots of bureaucratic and regulatory power in a ton of domains of national policy in the sense of it influences spending constraints, it influences what rights are protected. The common agricultural policy is a huge kind of piece of economic legislation. So on the day-to-day level, there's just a bunch of bureaucratic stuff that the EU does in terms of regulatory harmonization, free trade, the Schengen area, a whole bunch of stuff relating to just economic and political affairs or the European Court of Justice, whatever. There's a bunch of like specific things that have nothing to do with the topic. The thing that's weird about the security angle is that this is much newer from the perspective that the EU was not originally designed to be a security body, for instance, in the sense that like the purpose of the EU arguably was to prevent conflict through economic and political integration. The simple intuition for this is like, why did the EU come into existence in like 1991, basically? Well, that's when you get German reunification. And the logic is like, if you're France and Britain, well, Britain, RIP, I guess, no longer EU. But the concern was like, you want to avoid a kind of Second World War scenario of punishing and isolating and ostracizing historic enemies. So you integrate them, whatever. The problem is like the security dimension is newer because historically foreign policy was not directly in the EU's remit. And it's only more recently that the EU has shifted on the day-to-day basis towards like investment in defense and security. So on the actual day-to-day level, a lot of it is probably just like kind of individual bureaucratic stuff relating to regulations. What the EU is trying to do is to promote investment from EU states into their defense industrial bases and into militarization and trying to promote some level of cooperation between different member states. A lot of these are buzzwords because they just are buzzwords. Like the EU is great at putting out long papers that say lots of wonderful words and then not doing much action. Like number of like papers you can read from the EU that like you would think the EU has a standing military and has its own nuclear arsenal, and it just doesn't. But more seriously, I think there are a few ways that like EU involvement could look. So one of them might just be purely ceremonial. Like the EU could kind of almost in the same way that like, for example, countries will like mediate peace talks between warring parties, and then that country will get its spot on the Wikipedia page as like, well, the US mediated a ceasefire between, the DRC and the Congo or whatever. But like really, like the US was just playing an intermediate role. That's one possible way this works, which is that, the European Council kind of convenes and signs an official declaration of we will station French nuclear weapons in Poland. But in practice, this is just a France-Poland bilateral thing with the EU stamp of approval on it. The more involved way this might look like is the EU actually gets serious about, say, it creates like its own independent body that is directly relating to security integration, and it plays some role in the maintenance of the arsenal, or it, I don't know, builds a kind of small nuclear maintenance force that is deployed to Poland or is involved. I think the honest, more likely thing that happens is that you'd probably have some bodies that get formed to kind of like study this and discuss the legal implications of this and discuss, how to promote an ever closer European Union, but wouldn't necessarily have decision-making authority. And France probably would not be thrilled with the idea of the EU having any actual decision-making authority over this. And there's probably lots of other ways that the EU could like try to placate countries like Ireland that are not thrilled about the idea of nuclear weapons being introduced to the EU. So maybe, for example, you as the EU have a bunch of like big fancy meetings and conferences about the effects of nuclear weapons, and the EU plays some kind of almost like constructivist role in like building the case for nuclear weapons, but doesn't have a decision-making authority. The extreme end of it is like the EU actually creates a bureaucratic agency. I don't know, the Eurobomb agency or whatever. They definitely would not call it that, but it would be way cooler if they did. And they basically just play some direct role in nuclear sharing. It seems very risky if you're pro to say anything along these lines. A, because it massively ignites all of the kind of politics backlash arguments on a large scale. B, like whether you love the EU or hate the EU, the EU's like kind of tendency for bureaucratization is a real concern, and that's part of the reason the EU is not logically well positioned for defense, which is in times of conflict, what you're looking for typically is like a fast, rapid effective response. And it does not make sense to have 6 months of debate. And like I actually saw, I was in London last fall, and I actually got to see a bunch of these EU technocrats speak. And like after seeing some EU technocrats speak in the least stereotyping way, I was like, oh, I suddenly get like why people think of this as a very stuffy regulatory bureaucratic body. It's like, like the, room full of people in suits with very nice posh accents reading off these 50-page long reports. You don't want those people making military decisions, not because they're incapable, but because you want a effective response. If you're Putin and you think I can invade Poland and the EU will deliberate for 6 months before coming to an answer as to whether to use nuclear weapons, like of course you'll take that bet. Like Poland will be gone by the like you'll own the nuclear weapons before like the EU even comes to a decision. So that's possibly what it might look like. I think the maybe way that you might put it is like this might complement a broader shift towards the kind of common foreign and defense security policy of the EU. Like the EU is trying to move more, like in Rearm Europe, for example, towards like playing an active role in defense. It's possible that the EU might like create a body or designate one of its bazillion existing organs to facilitating this. And that body then eventually gets other purposes down the road. This is like a weird pro argument, but like the EU will use this as like a convenient justification to build up its own bureaucratic capability to facilitate security integration elsewhere. Like it'll create a body to help with the nuclear sharing stuff. And then the body will also then play some role in like encouraging defense production or in building
Right.
artillery, whatever. But the exact specific, like, this is why I think the topic is written oddly. I don't mean this in a pejorative way. Like, I think the topic is written badly. I just think it's weird because no one who's proposed this proposes this to be an EU thing.
Right.
Like, I mean, you probably researched this much more than I have, like the specific resolution.
No,
But
it's
like, I'm gonna
different.
guess that
Yeah.
if you like, my guess is if you Googled like EU, France, Poland nuclear sharing, and you cut the EU part of it, you'll get billions, trillions of results. And you add the EU thing into it, and you kind of narrow down the number of papers or think tanks that have thought about that specific question because it's less intuitive.
Yeah, I legitimately think it's like in the single digits, if any.
Yeah.
Like not a lot of stuff being written about the resolution as it's particularly worded, but a lot of stuff
Yeah.
being written about very similar things. I actually wanted to ask about that briefly. Do you think there's any chance of like, I mean, this would kind of be very unfortunate for the resolution because it would produce a bit of a race to the middle, but do you think there's any chance of like a bilateral non-EU nuclear sharing agreement cropping up in the status quo trend as an alternative to the resolution?
It's theoretically possible. I think it's tough because it's the sort of thing that like it might happen, but it'll probably not happen for several years. And so at this point, it's mostly speculative. Like there have been serious calls ever since, especially, well, obviously since Ukraine, and then more since JD Vance's speech in I think it
Right.
was February, where I actually watched it live and like, oh my God, it was insane. I was like, oh, what the heck is happening here? Like it was really wild. Like you could hear like the gasps in the. I wasn't there. I was watching it like live stream, but like you could literally hear people gasp when he was like, the big threat to Europe is not Russia. It is your government's restricting free speech. It's like, but Russia is a nuclear armed country that invaded one of your countries. Anyways, I think it's possible this happens. Again, I think the real world way this would happen is very slow, which is just to say that you spend 3 years studying it and debating it and talking about it. And eventually one party in France comes out and says, we think Poland maybe, possibly, theoretically, it is hypothetically conceivable that they would benefit from being included in our nuclear arrangement, but we're not really sure and we should just consider it. And then 2 years after that, you get some greater level of discussion. And eventually you get something akin to a nuclear sharing arrangement. There's one other way that this could happen that's a little freakier, but there's theoretically a world where like Russia miscalculates and it does one of its kind of like red line testing things that it does all the time now, like it cuts undersea cables or it interferes with the power grids and like whatever Lithuania. It does something that it's kind of been doing for years, but maybe it goes too far and it does something really escalatory that it doesn't intend to, or whatever it happens to be. And theoretically, there could be a big push in the aftermath of one of those kind of like sudden conflict flare-ups of we think it is possible that Poland could actually be hit in the next 2 years. We need to do something now before it's too late. It's not enough just to send military forces. We're going to put nuclear weapons on the ground. The reason I think that's implausible is that people, regardless of where you are in the world, are sufficiently terrified of nuclear weapons that nuclear weapons were almost always intended as we will stop a conflict before it begins, not a in a place that's about to have nuclear weapons, we want, or sorry, in a place that's about to have conflict, you typically don't want nuclear weapons. Like if you think about where, for example, the US has forward deployed nuclear weapons, it's deployed them in places where at the time of deployment, the risk of conflict was deemed somewhat low, maybe with the exception of like South Korea, where the risk of conflict is kind of perennial. But even in the Cold War, like the United States at no point ever, for example, would have been like, we are going to forward station nuclear weapons like right in South Vietnam, like right by the border with North Vietnam, because everyone's immediate concern will be, well, this is dumb because this increases the risk of nuclear war greatly. So it seems possible that you get a nuclear sharing arrangement, but potentially implausible. I think the much more likely thing is that you get some Russian redline testing, and then huge increased levels of defense spending on a
Yeah.
scale that even right now is kind of inconceivable. Like every country, like even Italy or Spain, who spends probably -% of its GDP on defense, says, "Oh my gosh, like this is freaky. Like we have to double, triple defense spending kind of overnight." And then you almost get like a kind of like war zone or like war economy footing.
That makes sense. Last question on the comparative before maybe we get into some fun stuff.
Oh
Uh,
yes.
Thoughts on the latest UK-France deal? I think it happened like a few days ago where Macron
Oh
and
yes.
Starmer, yeah, they agreed on like nuclear coordination. One thing that I thought was very unique about this that I haven't heard very much about, but is that like historically, the UK and France have agreed that their vital interests are threatened if the vital interests of the other is also threatened. So like we could conceivably we can't think of a scenario in which the UK gets threatened that France would not also be threatened, and therefore that would be sort of a time when we would use our nuclear weapons. The difference is that in this agreement, I think they sort of explicitly extended this to Europe. They said like we, the UK and France, cannot conceive of a circumstance in which Europe or other allies' security is threatened, in which our vital interests are not also threatened, which brings back the doctrine thing. So my question is like, how do you think this affects the topic? My intuition is that it takes away a little bit of ground from both sides in terms of like what is unique. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on like how big do you think this actually is?
Yeah, so I think that this is actually like a kind of good like intuition for pro on A, how Russia responds to kind of nuclear saber rattling, so to speak, and also B, like what the diplomatic or like kind of like public rationale process probably would look like for an official like nuclear sharing arrangement. I think in practice, most people agree that this won't meaningfully do much to deter Russia, just because like probably the logic behind the UK France is this is probably a bit of posturing and a bit of like, well, the only way that France and the UK could be threatened is that there was like like a continent-wide war, in which case, yeah, it makes sense that you would theoretically use nuclear weapons, whether in a strategic or tactical capacity. But I actually think that it might help pro weirdly, which is I doubt any con team will be like, well, we don't need a nuclear sharing arrangement because the UK and France already have you, and it's already good because we already have this kind of implicit nuclear umbrella that's extended to all of Europe. But I do think it's a kind of good illustration of like people probably exaggerate the degree to which Russia retaliates against anything that Putin dislikes. Like and this might be interesting evidence of that. Like, obviously, Putin has, I haven't followed specifically his response. I can't imagine he came out in support of this. But, there will no doubt be like lots of fiery rhetoric from the Kremlin about why this is antagonistic towards Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of actual policy outcomes, it doesn't really do much. So this might be kind of pro might weaponize this a bit in terms of like how Russia responds to nuclear discussions that affect Eastern Europe. On the flip side, probably if you're Khan, you might be able to think about how this affects like the need for French extension. There might also be an interesting question at play, which is suppose that as this kind of gets further discussed and French politicians keep talking about it, there might be an interesting question, which is whether or not this arguably overextends France's kind of nuclear pledges. Like one of the concerns with the U.S. nuclear umbrella, for example, is that the U.S. has so many security treaty allies that the strength of each individual alliance is maybe questionable because, well, if this country gets hit and that country gets hit and that country gets hit, would the US defend all of them? And that's arguably the NATO problem now. Maybe there's a concern, which is if you're France and you've said, the entirety of Europe falls under our protective umbrella, does that overextend it? I think this is unlikely just for the obvious reason that, like, there are very few countries that actually are at imminent risk of attack, and those are the countries where the nuclear commitment to defend is relevant. So it doesn't seem likely that there's an overextension concern. I think the other way, though, that theoretically Khan could use this in a funky way is to say this is evidence of European states taking seriously the threat from Russia, which is why the ongoing push to militarize, to increase coordination, to increase production for tanks, drones, artillery, et cetera, is substantial, and why this probably is part of a broader trend of the EU taking seriously the threat, and hence we don't necessarily need it. So probably it doesn't massively change the debate, is my guess, but it probably is useful as a small litmus test for
Yeah.
what these sorts of nuclear arrangements typically do to Russia and typically do to Europe.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I feel like it's a good way to ground the debate in reality,
Yeah,
because it's a response that everyone will always have against the most extreme scenarios is like, well, we saw something somewhat similar that should have probably triggered this, but it didn't. And so it's a good gut check device.
yeah.
Uh,
And my
okay,
guess is that like if Khan runs any like really like big like Russia will now respond by nuking Paris out of the blue. Well, now you've got an easy no, this
yeah,
this has already happened and the last time I checked Paris is alive.
right. Makes sense. Okay, for the last part of this call, if you still have time and
Oh
interest,
yes.
I want you to give me a little speech. So this will
Oh
work
exciting.
a bit, tiny bit differently from normal BP, but I do want you to give me what amounts to a PM speech from OG. Wording is going to be the same. You just don't get the same modeling power as you normally would in BP.
Fair.
Um, in the process, though, I'm going to give you four different arguments. So I want you to sort of expect the other side to say,
Got you.
you might not otherwise expect. I think for some of these, they'll be obvious, some won't be. These are just arguments I've heard pretty commonly from PFers. Um,
Interesting.
so the first argument is very intuitive. It's just Russia will respond negatively to this. So this will escalate tensions with Russia. This might invoke some sort of punishment from Russia. That could be in the form of gray zone escalations, things like cyber attacks, intensification of disinformation campaigns to spur more like far-right populism and maybe fracture the alliance to some degree, especially given that this is coming from the EU specifically. And it also might look like, I don't know, other things like the cutting of undersea cables, plenty of different things. In the worst case scenario, this could look like an escalation to war or some kind of miscalculation event. Um, and obviously that would be very bad. Second argument is that NATO might be duplicated a bit by this kind of structure, given that they already have their own nuclear sharing agreement that is led by the US. And there is some worry that if this agreement happens, there might be extra arguments within the US to withdraw some of the capabilities from NATO or from protecting Europe, sort of accelerating a trend that is already happening, or potentially creating a trend that is arguably being reversed right now with the latest like NATO summit and stuff. So that would be obviously very bad if we displace the US or displace or weaken NATO in any way by also diverting like resources away from them. That would potentially undermine deterrence rather than enhancing it. And that combined with the time frame harms of like this might take years, but that effect might be quite quick. You might actually create a big deterrence gap in the short term that would worsen all of the fears of the pro. Third argument is about EU fracturing. So this is just the argument that there are a lot of members in the EU who don't like nukes, like Austria, like Ireland, like Malta. But on top of that, there are a lot of different populist parties in EU countries that are fueled by these Eurosceptic perceptions of kind of Eurofederalism, like the EU taking more control over their politics and potentially even, I don't know, maybe the narrative is like now they're getting to decide who lives and who dies by like literally deciding who gets nuclear weapons, which seems like a big maybe overreach, or at least that's how it will be framed by these parties of control that could fuel some populist narratives that are already kind of simmering and end up actually fracturing the EU in some way, which would hurt deterrence and a lot of other important functions of the EU. Fourth argument is about French domestic politics. So it's a similar argument, but applied specifically to France, which is that the in our RN party, I guess, is maybe more likely to get elected, or at least there will be backlash against the centrist party, against Macron for doing an arrangement like this, especially given the context of French history with nukes and like the whole symbolic dependence on independent nuclear arsenal as a symbol of like sovereignty, rather than as something that can be shared with other countries. And so it is maybe more likely that either A, you get a weird gridlock scenario in France where like Parliament fights back against the implementation and that hamstrings it a bit, or B, you get some weird things with elections in 2027 or in Parliament where more far right like parliamentarians get elected and they reverse course a bit that hurts the credibility of the deterrent as well as like the overall cohesion of the EU and NATO and other structures like that. So those are the four arguments I think will be relatively common on the con. Um, and I want you to have them in mind when you construct this speech.
Interesting, interesting. Okay. I got you. I got you.
Cool. Do you want me to give you like 15 minutes of prep like normal?
Give me like 10 minutes and I'll like prep a
Okay.
PM. Is this get I'll actually treat this like it was like a proper like BP round. Like I'll actually prep a proper PM and then I'll
Okay,
I'll actually
perfect.
PM.
Perfect. If you need more than 10 minutes, obviously
No,
you're
10 minutes will be good.
oh.
10 minutes will be good.
Okay, hard mode then. So I will pause the recording and I'll put a 10-minute timer.
Excellent.
Okay, so what we're now going to do is a speech on, I guess, in BP terms, this would be the opening government side, the Prime Minister speech, which is the first speech in a British parliamentary round. We'll use the same PF topic. It'll be 7 minutes. I will not POI you, but
Yeah, valid.
but yeah, everything else will be normal. So. Without further ado, I call this house to order and I invite the Prime Minister to deliver the first government speech, not to exceed 7 minutes. Go for
All
it.
right. Woohoo. Let's see. Excellent. Russia poses an existential threat to continental European security. Alternative mechanisms dependent on non-credible US security guarantees fail. The best and only solution is nuclear sharing. First, let's characterize the likely implementation of an EU-mediated France-Poland or France-Eastern European nuclear sharing arrangement. The most obvious candidate for nuclear sharing probably is Poland or a state in the Baltics like Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, because those countries face the greatest threat from Russia, both due to their historic connection to the Russian Empire and their large population of Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian citizens. This means that the most plausible candidates for nuclear sharing are those states. How is nuclear sharing likely to work in such contexts? Realistically, this doesn't occur overnight. Rather, the EU and French politicians and media and think tanks spent several years gradually building the public's case for French nuclear sharing. They have strong incentives both to rationalize nuclear sharing arrangements in terms of an emphasis on French sovereignty. For example, the vast majority of French citizens, including most of those on the far right, are relatively opposed to Russia, both due to historic reasons, for example, Russian aggression against the West during the Cold War, and for contemporary reasons like Russian aggression against the EU vis-a-vis energy warfare. And they have strong incentive to discuss this in the context of French greatness, for example, as positioning France as a European leader and cementing itself as the new power in the 21st century, which is powerful mitigation against any op argument on far-right backlash, because if the RN seeks to portray itself as the defender of French greatness and the defender of French sovereignty, the easiest way for center-left parties and center-right parties to directly counter that claim is to characterize the existence of a nuclear sharing arrangement as contributing to French greatness. In the longer term, the likely way this nuclear sharing arrangement then works is twofold. First, in the interim period, France probably spends several billions of euros miniaturizing its nuclear arsenal in order to develop tactical or battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, and subsequently engages in talks with the EU, which establishes agreements between France and Poland or France and Lithuania to forward deploy air-launched tactical nuclear weapons to regional battlefields and air bases in Eastern Europe. The likely nuclear doctrine that will subsequently be implemented establishes that if existential interests are threatened, for example, by Russian aggression, then French and its partners in these nuclear sharing arrangements reserve the right to utilize nuclear weapons. Notably, this threat doesn't need to be absolutely credible to establish effective deterrence, because both Putin and those around him are sensitive to the threat of their own destruction, because even if they are irrational and even if they are paranoid, that is precisely why the possibility of their nuclear annihilation keeps them up at night. And we have evidence that Putin is concerned about this prospect. For example, the fact he has historically engaged in red line testing as opposed to overt violation of Western red lines, and the fact that there is evidence that Putin himself is afraid of his own death. For example, there are widespread reports he frequently watches the video of Gaddafi's assassination, which probably means he's paranoid and doesn't want to take the unnecessary risk of exterminating his own regime. First argument, Russia poses an existential threat to Polish and Baltic security best solved under our side. Why does Russia pose such a threat? The obvious reason is because the irredentist policy of Putin is to expand Russia territorially into Eastern Europe. This is both one, because countries like Poland and Finland have historic ties to Russian greatness. For example, they were often involved in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and because they have large populations of Russian-speaking individuals and ethnic Russians, which means that Putin has a political incentive to capture these areas if doing so is theoretically feasible. And the long history of Russian aggression against these places, like the 1939 invasion of Poland, is further evidence this threat is credible. Notably, Putin will have the capacity to fight such a war in the longer term, and the war in Ukraine does not preclude him from doing so, both because the war in Ukraine probably ends at some point, especially given Trump's pressuring Ukraine into accepting a peace deal, and because Russia has pivoted towards a Kalashnikov war-footing economy in which military production is through the roof, and the Russian military has learned lessons from Ukraine it's looking to impose elsewhere. Why are alternative deterrence mechanisms insufficient to stop Putin from acting aggressively? NATO is clearly lacking in credibility in two regards. First, even if Trump would actually honor NATO Article 5, the vast majority of European states and Russia itself does not view this as credible, given Trump's penchant for randomly shirking international treaty obligations and his disdain for Europe. And furthermore, the US is pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific in containing China, which means that you cannot depend on NATO. Even if in the long term NATO shifts away from the EU as a consequence of nuclear sharing, the EU needs to develop mechanisms now to deal with that. And in the short term, the US is more likely to support Europe as opposed to pull away as a consequence of nuclear sharing. This is because the explicit aim of the United States under Trump is to increase European militarization, which is why Trump is demanding 5% defense spending as a percent of GDP, which means that the US is more likely to view a nuclear sharing arrangement as the EU finally stepping up to the mantle and accepting its own defense, as opposed to free riding on European commitments. Furthermore, notably, Poland and the Baltics currently lack escalation dominance against Russia because Russia can engage in nuclear saber rattling against those states, but those states, even with conventional militaries, are unable to threaten any credible retaliation against Russia, which means there is no conventional deterrent against Russia. Why then is nuclear sharing the best way to deter conflict? First, there is a credible threat of deterrence by punishment, and notably this threat is severe enough that Russia has to listen to it, both because Putin depends on military generals around him who selfishly are concerned by even the 10% chance of nuclear annihilation, but also because this is the first time since functionally the Cold War that Russia faces a severe and real security threat, which means that at a constructivist level, the instinctual response from Russian security leadership is to treat this threat seriously. The op response potentially is that Russia will retaliate, but one, this is ongoing presently, so the impact is marginal. Two, we can flip this. It is more likely that Russia engages in gray zone warfare when it believes the West lacks the resolve to respond. The best way to signal a credible threat of retaliation is for France to forward deploy nuclear weapons to the region to establish that the EU takes the security of its member states seriously. And even though this is unlikely to be met by nuclear escalation, the fact that it could is is sufficient to trigger deterrence. The other potential op response is that the nuclear deterrent lacks credibility. Not true. First, there are lots of ways that France can establish nuclear credibility, for example, by communicating a clear nuclear doctrine, imposing tripwire forces in the region whose death would invoke a nuclear response, and engaging in training exercises with the Polish military. And there are strong reasons why the French government can impose this mechanism in a way that the EU supports. Their potential response is that the EU will then backlash against this or become divided. Unlikely. First, even if countries are opposed to this in principle, they are not sufficiently opposed that they would leave the EU, both because they depend on the EU for security and because they need defensive or economic benefits from the EU, like free trade. And far-right parties are unlikely to gain that much power as a consequence of this. First, many far-right parties are explicitly anti-Russia. For example, the Brothers of Italy in Italy is explicitly opposed to Russia. But furthermore, most EU skeptics primarily focus on cultural issues like immigration or unemployment, and a focus on foreign policy is not central to what these parties are standing for. Therefore, the likely outcome of this policy is deterring Russian aggression when all of the alternative mechanisms fail, and this better solves the long-term threat posed by by far-right populism. The reason for this is that a war in Poland would be economically devastating for Europe, and the biggest link into far-right populism is economic collapse. So the best way to stop far-right politics from arising is simply to invest into deterrence to prevent such a conflict from fueling far-right populism. Therefore, propose.
Beautiful. That was a wonderful speech. Let's dig into just like a couple of the things that I noticed in this speech, and then maybe I'll let you go.
Yeah,
We
yeah, sounds good.
recently, you've been very generous with your time once again. Um, so first, one of the things that I really like that I think you do in a lot of your BP speeches is the constant work of sort of like pushing the charitability. Like even if you don't buy that, or even if, reasonably it might be the case that this doesn't pan out completely, we still have an argument here, and here's why. I think this is something that PFers definitely can learn from. The PF version of this speech looks very different, at least in terms of how people are normally treating PF these days. It looks much more like Russia will attack right now, and we will deter them only in our world, and that will lead to nuclear annihilation, and that's it. There's like
Yeah,
nothing
fair.
else, right? Sometimes you get a little bit of nuance, but it's quite rare. And the nuance that you do get is also phrased in sort of absolute terms. So it's more squirrely than charitable, I would say. So I think that this is one thing that actually, to me, it very clearly strengthens these arguments because it sort of inoculates them against both against very obvious responses that the other side can and should make. But second, and more pressing, I think, for a lot of PFers against judge hacking as well.
Yeah.
And this is something I think this is something that definitely can be learned from BP specifically because PFers often complain about BP being an event where judge like intervention is more formalized, which is to some extent fair. I think that there's a very good defense of this. But the thing that PFers complain about even more is the judge intervention that happens in their own event, which I think we can both accept as inevitable. Like some level
Yeah,
of
for sure.
judge, right? Like if there's an obvious hole in an argument, the fact of the matter is that any judge, no matter who they are, they're going to be somewhat less likely to vote for that argument compared to the same argument without that hole. And so I think one way to like inoculate yourself against some judge intervention in PF, even when that is not something that you maybe are supposed to have to inoculate yourself against, it is nonetheless a reality. And so this is one of the best ways to overcome it. Um, Other stuff that I saw you doing in this speech, I like the preemption, like the explicit preemption of the arguments that I was talking about. I think that it's quite efficient and creative and sort of approaches it from a lot of different angles. And I think that you've convinced me through this a little bit that maybe the topic is a bit more balanced. What is your like own self-reflection about this speech or what your own analysis?
I mean, I mistimed it a bit. I meant to do a lot more work specifically on like the credibility establishment stuff. So I think that the main takeaway I have from this is that like the very last thing I got to probably deserves more proper development, which is like I kind of mentioned this a while back, but like I think that the smart way to think about this on on pro is like really painting a like deeply pessimistic picture of what the status quo looks like and how bad a war in Poland or the Baltics would be, and then establishing this as a plausible way that we would deter such a conflict. Because if you can do a good job establishing that the impacts of conflict trigger most of ops concerns, like
Right.
far right populism gaining power or economic like I didn't say this explicitly, but like probably the main reason leaving the EU, for example, would be bad is because there's economic harms. But if the economic harms of war are worse and war is unique to con, then perhaps you weigh it there. Obviously, all of these require a very specific link to be true, which is war doesn't happen in pro and it does happen in con. But I think that the way that you can think about it is kind of more like the expected value calculus of like it's not that there's like a 100% chance of war in con and a 0% chance in pro. It's like there might be a 40% chance of war in con and a 15% chance of war in pro. But the relevant point is that like weirdly, if you go to war, like the world might kind of be bad either way, and maybe it's worse in pro because there's a risk of nuclear escalation. But what you're really trying to do in pro is win whatever that percentage gap, so to speak, is in the probability of conflict between pro and con, and then like blow up the impacts of that
Right.
scenario. And that's I think the thing that I probably missed the most. I think outside of that, like. I think what's interesting about this topic and where it differs between BP probably and PF is like in BP, you would probably reliably expect teams to have pretty predictable stances in terms of what they think Putin slash Russia will do. So, for example, the way that you would imagine every BP team to approach this is Gov says Putin will attack unless we do nuclear sharing, and Op says no. Actually, we think that Putin has, here's a bazillion reasons he won't attack. And PF, like probably strategically, it gets a little funkier. Like for example, I actually think one of the genuinely interesting strategies on Khan is just to concede that Putin attacks either way. And this is like really risky for obvious reasons, but like concede the pro and be like, yeah, we think Putin can't be deterred ever. And that's why he's going to war no matter what. We just do not want nuclear escalation, which is an argument you really wouldn't see that much in BP
Mhm.
if ever. But I think that like the strategic, like I guess to use an IR term, there's a lot more strategic ambiguity, I think, or strategic flexibility here for especially whatever team is speaking second, because a lot of this is like weird game theory stuff, I think. So, like for example, if I was rebutting this speech, like the way I'd personally think about it is like the speech concedes a lot about how risk averse Putin is or how receptive to punishment Putin is. And if that is true, then you probably can build a pretty strong case to say, well, by this logic, the probability of invasion is actually pretty low. Or arguably, even a non-credible US threat of retaliation might still be sufficient.
Right.
So, like, there's like a lot of weird stuff, which is like, how again it's this weird equilibrium question of like roughly how bad is the status quo slash risk of war, how much does nuclear sharing change that, and so forth. That's probably like the thing I think that I could spend more time on, but overall I think that like the probably BP version of this debate is much more predictable than the debate you'll have on average in PF is my guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does seem like my understanding of this topic has changed a bit through this call. It seems like by most accounts, the pro is just trying to make one argument, and the con is just trying to disprove that argument, basically, which is just deterrence.
Yeah,
If you win the argument, if you are have very good strategic weighing, and most of the big stick con arguments are probably fake, you should be able to win the round on the pro. The problem is that you have to need very careful treatment of this like weird Goldilocks stuff where it's very easy for your characterization for the link to get in the way of your uniqueness and vice
yeah,
versa.
exactly.
Um, but I think if you are able to do that, like you can sort of treat every single con argument you might expect as just like an extra in BB terms, like burden that you have to
Yeah,
overcome.
exactly.
And then if you like just spend like a week crafting a deterrence argument that accounts for all of the possible material from the con, well, then it should be very powerful. Like, then you should be able to coast through some of these rounds where teams haven't actually thought about the debate as deep as you have and instead are going more broad. But
Yeah.
the last question I have is actually on going more broad. So PF, I told you before, like, and it is very true that PFers love on this topic to go as broad as possible and really find like the most out there scenarios. Examples I've already heard on this topic. I heard an argument about like how for some reason the pro spurs more like economic investment in the Sahel region of Africa, which stops terrorism. I've heard an argument that and I don't want to be mean, like these are real people's arguments. I'm sure like
Huh.
people are having fun, they're being creative. I don't really see
Yeah,
link
sure.
most of them. But that's kind of the vibe. So my question for you is what are the wacky like out there research areas that you think PFers can dive into if they're looking for a greater diversity that hopefully does have some link to the topic?
Oh, let me think. Let me think. Okay. I think there is, I think it's extremely implausible, and I doubt there's any research on this. I would love to see a really well-made, like, Russian Civil War argument somehow on Khan, which is like this trigger, like, I guess the link would be forward deployment of nuclear weapons, like, shatters confidence in Putin's regime. There's like an attempted military coup, and then like Russia collapses into a civil war. Like, there's probably some weird stuff there somehow, I'd guess that like is pretty far-fetched, but like kind of I guess could be quasi interesting. There's got to be stuff about Taiwan somehow. Like there's got to be some link into why this makes war in Taiwan more likely, and how this potentially like affects that dynamic. So there's this crazy link that like it's downstream of the conflict clash, but I guess I'll send the article to you. So there's this kind of Substack series I read every now and then that's pretty interesting. And basically, it's this guy who's like anti-nuclear weapons, but he has a very interesting argument for it. I'll connect it to the topic in a second. At first, it won't seem clear, but then I'll relate it. So basically, the big question he researches is why have nuclear weapons never been used? And the obvious answer everyone has is like mad, but that doesn't make sense for why nuclear weapons have never been used against non-nuclear states. And so he goes through every possible reason. He's basically, these are all dumb. And so his answer is the reason that nuclear weapons have never been used is because they basically just don't like work as a military tool. They're kind of useless militarily. And this is not a crazy argument, but his argument basically is the reason you should be really scared of nuclear weapons being used is not the reason everyone's scared of them, which is, nuclear weapons really scary. It's because once nuclear weapons are used once, everyone will kind of realize that actually they just don't have the deterrence power that everyone thinks they do because they're militarily not that useful as weapons. They're really good at blowing up cities, and that's about it. They're not great as battlefield weapons. And so his argument is once nuclear weapons are used once, every other country in the world will realize they're basically useless deterrents and they'll lose all their deterrence power. And then basically all nuclear armed countries will go to war with each other. I think this is like a crazy escalation scenario, but theoretically, the way you could do it is like, I don't know, Khan somehow runs an argument that's like, tactical nuclear weapons will get used, and then everyone realizes that these are all fake, and then India, Pakistan go to war, China, the U.S. go to war. I don't know, something like that, and things kind of get weird. There's got to be some like really funky pro stuff on like why EU dissolution is good. I think it's like kind of wild, but not that crazy. I don't know. Maybe, for example, if you could prep some like turns to like why Ireland's economy would be better off leaving the EU, like maybe there's just like a crazy way to approach this, which is,
Yeah.
Khan is like Ireland leaves EU, and then you're like, aha, here are five cards that say that's great for the Irish economy or whatever that happens to be, and stuff like that. I think the most interesting stuff to like research though definitely is like finding specific cases where like nuclear deterrence failed, and then like researching them quite a lot and trying to figure out like what the like kind of problem was, and then like this is not crazy, but it's like you'll spend a lot of time researching stuff that will never be cut into a card. Like I truly do not think, for example, if you stood up and you were like, well, in 1973, in October, this thing happened, and therefore in, October 2027, when Russia is considering it, like probably this doesn't work, but I think like having historical basis for this could be kind of interesting. The other stuff that could be like kind of interesting, I mean, this is more like a kind of fun thing to read than anything else, is like you can read almost all of the US war plans for how they intended to use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. Some of them are still classified. I asked one of my professors, like, why are they like this is from like the late 1940s, like, why are they still classified? Apparently, the reason is because the US, like, these war plans are basically if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, the US had a bunch of plans like, here's how we'll use nuclear weapons to stop the war. And the US kind of smartly realized that like its European allies might not love the idea that the US spent many years just game planning how to bomb all of Europe, like Germany and France and all of like US allies. But they actually could be kind of interesting for like gaining a better understanding of how theoretically nuclear weapons actually like everyone will know the phrase deter through denial or deter through punishment. But it'd be kind of interesting to research it a bit more. Um, maybe there's like some I think there's got to be some like weird stuff on like how this affects other countries Russia is aligned with. Like I think there's like okay, this argument is actually like genuinely insane. There might be a weird argument that like Khan concedes the pro and like is like, yeah, you're right. Russia will give up on Eastern Europe and it'll now turn its focus to like Central Asia and it'll invade like Kazakhstan or whatever. And like you run like a Kazakh war scenario and like I think this is insane, but you know,
This
you
is
can probably
like you've hit the nail on the head. This is like exactly the flavor of arguments that PF
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
going to
So like
be
you,
doing.
there's got to be some like Central Asian war scenario somehow. There's like there's got to be so like a while back people were really freaked out because Russia had this proposal where it was going to put like nuclear weapons on satellites in space and just like fly them around, and it could basically just drop them at any moment. There's got to be some way that you like link this topic
Yeah.
to that, and then run some problem with that, or whatever.
Like an
Like
escalation link, like Russia
yeah, yeah, yeah.
responds by you're gonna put nukes in my backyard or
Yeah.
put them in space.
Yeah. There's got to be some weird things. So like for example, oh, this would be actually this could be kind of interesting. Okay, this is really far-fetched. So France has airborne missiles. Airborne missiles typically are using GPS. You could probably find a card that's like here, like French nuclear armed cruise missiles are GPS equipped, and then try to make some argument that Russia will hit the French GPS satellites, and then like run like arguments on why this has like weird space like this like starts a space war where like then NATO retaliates by hitting Russian satellite. I don't know. There's like some satellite escalation scenario that goes like space wars that I guess could become kind of weird. I think there's like okay, if you want like the crazy scenario, like genuinely insane, um, like this is like so far, I actually don't even think the techiest tech judge out there would vote for it, but I don't know, maybe there might be a weird argument, which is, how would you make it work? Basically, the argument I'm trying to find a way to link into is that China invades Russia. There's like you can find some weird cards that are like China has like border disputes with Russia and or thinks Putin is irrational or paranoid or like a threat to Chinese security. And theoretically, China would I have no idea why they'd want to invade Russia. This seems like the stupidest idea ever. And if there's one lesson from history everyone knows, it's you don't invade Russia, especially in the winter. But there's got to be some link into it somehow, or like this causes a border skirmish there in some theoretical way. I don't know. The other really odd thing that I guess you could try to run on Khan, this is again stupid, but the US will withdraw its nuclear weapons from Europe. That argument's saying that's fine or whatever. But then trying to run like the US will like be lobbied by the military industrial complex to station them somewhere else, but like pick like really odd country like I don't know, like find some card that's like the US will forward deploy nuclear weapons to like Brazil or something. I don't know, and then like run some weird like Brazil politics far right Bolsonaro comes back. I don't know, like some weird thing or whatever. But like you can definitely like run kind of somewhat odd stuff like that. There's one final thing that I think is like really wild, um, like pretty insane. So one of the original rationales for France like getting nukes was, I mean, they never said it, but like part of it is like you don't know if the U.S. will always be your ally, and so you kind of want nukes for that purpose. I think it would be wickedly funny to see someone try to run like a this deters the US argument. Like I don't know what the logic is, but I guess it could be like I don't know. I guess it could be something about like you forward deploy nuclear weapons to like Portugal and then the US can't invade Portugal or something. I don't know, because like obviously the US can't invade France anyways. The other like weird thing, there's got to be a Turkey argument somewhere. I don't know how the argument works, but like there's got to be something just because A, they have forward deployed weapons and B, like they could like for example, there might be an interesting, really crazy con line to or no, pro line to run, which is if the EU can't do security through nuclear sharing, it'll need to massively expand its conventional forces. Turkey has been trying to join the EU for years, but Turkey has never been let in. But Turkey is the second largest military in NATO. Maybe the EU will have to let Turkey in, absent nuclear sharing, and then run some like weird arguments about why it's bad for Turkey. Again, this is crazy, but you know, there's some like crazy stuff out there. I do think though, for what it's worth, stuff on like Russian political instability could be really interesting because it's actually not crazy to me that like it is improbable that Putin would be ousted in a coup, for example, because of this. But there definitely could be kind of some somewhat interesting things there that could be worth looking into that are actually pretty serious.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you've given us a lot of wacky ideas, some more than
Yeah,
others.
there's some craziness.
I guarantee you at some point in the topic we're gonna hear like the Kazakhstan invasion scenario or something. And I'm
This would
like,
be so
man, I'm
wild.
gonna think of you.
Yeah. There's one other one that I think there's this conflict I like read a lot about in the fall, and I haven't followed it as much. So there's this breakaway state called Transnistria in
Yeah,
Moldova,
Moldova.
and there's got to be like a I don't know exactly what. I guess the argument would be like maybe there's like a con argument that's like Russia will now pull its support from Transnistria to like focus on gray zone warfare in the Baltics. And so Moldova will invade Transnistria because like now they'll see an opportunity with like Russia pulling away. This seems crazy, but I don't know. I'm sure someone can run an argument on it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like all of those little like places around Russia are ripe. Like
Yeah.
just like I don't know, point at a border of Russia and you'll find some scenario. You got like the Arctic scenarios, um
Yeah.
you've got like the Central Asian stuff we talked about, including like South Ossetia and all the Georgia stuff. Um you've got maybe something Asia question mark.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm sure all of those at some point or another will crop up in the topic. We've got a
Yeah,
long
yeah, like there's like a Japan war scenario somehow
time.
probably. Like I
Or
don't know,
like
like
Korean Peninsula, like they do border North Korea,
yeah.
technically.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of like really improbable scenarios
Yeah.
that you can try to go for that would be kind of funny.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking so much about Russia and French nuclear weapons.
Always.
And for actually giving me a speech. It's been a pleasure talking with you as always.
Same to you. Thank you for having me on.
And also, once again, thank you for the wonderful contribution you've made to the collective topic knowledge of PF by us this great topic sort of primer document, which once again is going to be linked in the description. Any final parting words?
Uh, Nuclear weapons are kind of a wild thing, and it's interesting to read about them. I guess like the last thing I will just say is like not really a debate comment, but like this is like a genuinely okay. This is gonna make me sound like a 70-year-old like sitting back in an armchair, but like we are in kind of genuinely crazy times, and so I actually do think that this is a very cool topic because regardless of whether you think it's pro weighted or con weighted or whether you lose, go 0-5 and every judge is like you were nonsense or not. Like this arguably is maybe one of the probably 3 to 5 most pressing foreign policy questions in the world right now, probably. So it is pretty cool that like, regardless of whether you're great at the topic or hate it or love it or whatever, it's important. And, like this topic will be like in probably 5 years, people will look back and be like, this is really interesting. Like I think I looked back the other day just for fun and like I think 2013, 14, like I think PF set like a NATO Ukraine type motion
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
that
Nats,
like
yeah.
like that topic has aged fantastically. Like, I mean, if you debated it then, like you have some thoughts on what's going on today. So, like, it's the sort of thing where it's like, yeah, debate's a fun competitive activity, and sure, there's some crazy Cossack war scenarios to run, but there definitely is like a lot of genuinely interesting stuff to know about the world as it stands today.
Yeah, 100%. The stuff we're talking about here is real, and the research you do will actually stay with you. And I know that's like obvious, but I don't know. I feel like sometimes I didn't really realize it until afterwards. So it's good to realize it now. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, once again, and I will see you later.